The child is barely moving. Behind the glass, beneath the low amber glow of heated lamps, the infant lies wrapped in white linen, no larger than a folded newspaper. The chest rises faintly, so faintly that those gathered outside the enclosure occasionally lean forwards just to check whether movement continues at all. Some watch with fascination, others with discomfort, and a few even remove their hats and speak in a lowered voice, as though they were entering a chapel. But this is not a hospital ward. Just beyond the polished enclosure comes the distant sound of music, mechanical rides, and the restless movement of crowds. People pass carrying programs and refreshments. Children stare through the glass before being ushered on by parents unsure whether this qualifies as education or entertainment. A sign nearby explains the process in reassuring terms. Carefully regulated warmth, filtered air, scientific supervision. And beneath it, another notice. Admission, 25 cents. The baby inside has been born too early. Under ordinary circumstances, there's every likelihood the child would not survive the week. But these are not ordinary circumstances. For the price of entry, the public has come to witness a strange new possibility. That life itself might be preserved through machinery, observation, and sufficient financial backing. Allow me to introduce the Baby Incubator. I'm your host, Alex Sweetman, and this is the Old Money's Cabinet of Curiosities, where we examine the inventions that emerge when desperation meets ingenuity, and where progress often arrives carrying questions no one is entirely prepared to answer. At its core, the early baby incubator was a controlled environment, a heated enclosure designed to sustain premature infants whose bodies could not yet reliably regulate temperature on their own. But as always, these things are more complex when broken down. Most early models resembled cabinets more than medical devices. Constructed from wood or metal, they typically incorporated glass panels on several sides, allowing the infant to remain visible while enclosed within a carefully warmed interior. Heat was generated through hot water reservoirs, steam systems, or oil lamps positioned beneath or alongside the chamber. Ventilation was considered essential, although it was poorly understood by modern standards. Airflow systems attempted to create a circulation of warmed air while preventing stagnation. Some designs even incorporated filters made from wool or cotton in an effort to reduce contamination from the outside world. Temperature regulation, however, remained imprecise. Too little heat and the infant would weaken further. Too much and dehydration or respiratory distress could follow. Constant monitoring was therefore required. Inside, the child would rest on a small mattress or a suspended cot, heavily wrapped to conserve warmth. Nurses would adjust the blankets, they'd check the breathing, and they would monitor the feeding with meticulous attention. The incubator's appearance served both a practical and psychological role. Glass panels served a practical purpose, allowing observation without excessive handling of the child, but they also reassured viewers. Visibility implied safety. If the machine could be watched, if it could be inspected, then it could be trusted. That transparency would later become central to the incubator's unusual public life. By modern standards, the devices were primitive, but their underlying principle that environmental control could preserve vulnerable life was profoundly significant. For perhaps the first time, survival itself appeared to be something that technology could meaningfully influence. To understand the rise of the baby incubator, it's necessary to understand how Victorian society viewed infant death. By modern standards, mortality rates were staggering. In many industrial cities throughout the 19th century, a substantial proportion of children would die before reaching their 5th birthday. Disease, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and overcrowding, all of these combined to make early childhood precarious, even under normal conditions. Premature infants occupied an even more uncertain position. Many physicians regarded them with resignation rather than urgency. If a child was born significantly underweight or too early, it was often considered unlikely to survive regardless of intervention. Medical resources, as limited as they were, tended to be directed elsewhere, and families adapted accordingly. Children would be baptized quickly, and emotional attachment was often cautious during the early days of life. Grief existed, certainly, but repeated exposure to infant mortality altered the social rhythm surrounding it. Death wasn't exceptional, it was familiar. And then gradually, attitudes began to shift. Part of this shift emerged from a broader development in medicine and public health during the late 19th century. Germ theory gained acceptance. From that, sanitation improved, surgery became safer, and across Europe and North America, confidence in scientific intervention grew rapidly. At the same time, industrialization transformed society's relationship with machinery. Machines no longer merely produced goods, increasingly they were used to manage environments. Heating systems would regulate temperature, ventilation systems would control air, and mechanical precision became associated with reliability and progress. Within this atmosphere, the possibility of sustaining premature infants through controlled warmth no longer seemed implausible. The earliest infant incubators appeared in France during the 1880s, influenced in part by agricultural incubators used to hatch poultry eggs. The conceptual leap was unsettlingly simple. If temperature and airflow could be used to sustain fragile life in one context, perhaps it could in another. Early successes attracted attention quickly, and medical congresses displayed the devices as marvels. World's fairs incorporated them into exhibitions of modern science, and newspapers reported on survival rates with fascination. But hospitals were slow to adopt the technologies, at least consistently. Incubators were expensive. They required specialized care and constant supervision. And many institutions lacked both the funding and the confidence to commit resources to infants that were still widely perceived as medically uncertain. And into that hesitation stepped an unusual solution: public exhibition. By the 1890s and early 1900s, incubator installations began appearing at exhibitions and amusement parks across Europe and the United States. Premature infants were placed inside heated glass enclosures, while paying audience members observed them from beyond carefully maintained barriers. The arrangement seems somewhat contradictory, part medical demonstration, part charitable enterprise, and part spectacle. And yet, for many infants, it worked. The baby incubator emerged from a collision between compassion and practicality. At its most basic level, the device addressed a straightforward physiological problem. Premature infants struggled to maintain their body temperature. Without sufficient warmth, their already fragile systems would deteriorate rapidly, and the incubator provided stability. Heat could be maintained, exposure reduced, conditions controlled with a degree of consistency that was impossible in many of the overcrowded homes or underfunded hospital wards. But practical utility alone doesn't explain the incubator's cultural impact. What the machine truly offered wasn't simply warmth. It offered intervention, a visible assertion that survival was no longer entirely dependent on fate. This mattered enormously in the late 19th century. Victorian society increasingly believed that science and engineering could overcome problems once accepted as inevitable. Diseases were being studied systematically, cities redesigned around sanitation, and industry reorganized around efficiency and precision. The incubator fit naturally within this worldview. It transformed fragility into something measurable, observable, manageable. And the child behind the glass became evidence that modernity itself could exert control over nature's uncertainty. And yet, this confidence existed alongside a profound social inequality. Most infants displayed in public incubator exhibitions came from poor or working-class families. Wealthier families typically had access to private physicians or domestic care arrangements. These would have been unavailable to others. For the urban poor, however, the options were limited or entirely absent. This is where the exhibitions fill the gap. Parents arrived not because the arrangement felt dignified, but because alternatives had already failed them. Many hospitals refused premature infants outright, or lacked the facilities to care for them adequately. The incubator offered possibility where very little otherwise existed. But possibility came at a price. Public viewing generated revenue, revenue-funded nurses and equipment, heating, maintenance and expansion. Visitors paid admission fees not simply to observe technology, but to witness vulnerability being managed successfully. This arrangement carried a peculiar moral logic to it. The spectacle became acceptable because it served humanitarian functions. The public could reassure itself that the observation wasn't exploitation, it was participation. By purchasing a ticket, visitors were supporting life itself, and often they genuinely were. That ambiguity is central to the incubator's story. Unlike many Victorian curiosities, this invention produced undeniable results. Premature infants survived at rates previously considered impossible. The machine justified itself continuously through positive outcomes, and success softened the ethical scrutiny. Questions that might otherwise have seemed intolerable became easier to accommodate when confronted with living proof and evidence of its success. The incubator therefore occupied a deeply uncomfortable space. It turned care into performance. It rendered private vulnerability publicly visible and charged admission for it. It also saved lives that conventional medicine had largely abandoned. Victorian society proved remarkably comfortable with this compromise. Progress was rarely viewed as clean or uncomplicated in this land. Industrialization had normalized the idea that discomfort and advancement often arrived together. Factories injured workers while expanding prosperity. Urban growth created suffering while promising opportunity. The incubator belonged in this same moral atmosphere. A machine that was both compassionate and transactional, humane and unsettling simultaneously. And beneath it all remained a deeper belief that sufficiently advanced systems could correct even the frailties of human biology. Given enough ingenuity, life could be stabilized mechanically. The story of the baby incubator does not belong to a single inventor. It emerged instead through overlapping networks of physicians, engineers, exhibitors, nurses, and entrepreneurs, each shaping the technology according to different priorities. Among the earliest influential figures was the French obstetrician Stéphane Tarnier, who introduced one of the first widely recognized infant incubators in Paris during the 1880s. Tarnier drew directly from poultry incubators for inspiration. They were used in agriculture, and he adapted the principle of controlled warmth for neonatal care. His work produced measurable improvements in survival rates, lending credibility to the concept within parts of the medical community. Another important figure was Pierre Constant Boudin, who is often regarded as one of the founders of modern neonatology. Boudin emphasized careful feeding, hygiene, and sustained observation alongside the incubator technology itself. He understood that the machine alone was insufficient. Survival depended equally upon disciplined care and the incubator. But the most publicly visible advocate became Martin Cooney. Cooney remains a difficult figure to categorize neatly. He presented himself as a physician, though the exact nature of his medical credentials remained ambiguous throughout his life. What is undeniable, however, is his effectiveness. From the late 19th century into the early 20th, Cooney operated incubator exhibitions at the world's fairs and at amusement parks across Europe and the United States, including installations at Coney Island. His exhibitions were meticulously organised. Rows of incubators stood beneath carefully controlled lighting. Uniformed nurses maintained strict routines. Cleanliness was emphasised constantly, both for medical necessity and for public reassurance. Visitors paid admission to observe premature infants receiving care, and Cooney understood something that hospitals hadn't yet fully recognised, that survival requires funding, and funding requires visibility. The exhibitions financed themselves. This was critical because many mainstream hospitals at the time remained reluctant to invest heavily in premature infant care. The technology was expensive, staffing demands were substantial, and outcomes, although improving, still remained uncertain. Cooney's model bypassed the institutional hesitation entirely. Public fascination became infrastructure, and behind the spectacle stood nurses whose contributions were rarely acknowledged with equal prominence. Their labour was continuous and highly skilled. They monitored temperatures, prepared feedings, maintained sanitation, and responded immediately to signs of distress. Without them, the machines would have meant very little. Manufacturers competed aggressively within the growing market. Designs varied in airflow systems, heating reliability, access panels, and methods of sanitation, and patents proliferated as firms attempted to distinguish their model through technical refinements. Advertising language increasingly framed incubators not simply as equipment, but as symbols of scientific modernity. And this mattered, because the incubator was selling more than just survival. It was selling confidence in the future. By the early decades of the 20th century, the public incubator exhibition began to fade. Not because the technology failed, but because it succeeded. As neonatal medicine became increasingly professionalised, hospitals gradually incorporated incubator care into standard medical practice. Advances in hygiene, nursing, and paediatric medicine all improved outcomes even further, while specialised hospital wards began replacing temporary exhibition spaces. At the same time, public attitudes shifted. What had once been framed as educational or progressive increasingly appeared inappropriate. The spectacle of vulnerable infants displayed before paying audiences became harder to reconcile with changing ideas about privacy, medicine, and dignity. The incubator itself remained, but the visibility surrounding it diminished. Glass walls persisted inside hospitals, though now shielded from public admission queues and amusement park crowds. Observation became clinical rather than performative, and in many ways the earlier exhibitions slipped into historical discomfort. Not entirely condemned, not entirely celebrated, just simply repositioned within a more complicated understanding of medical progress and public ethics. The babies disappeared from view, the machines remained in use, just out of sight. The Victorian baby incubator presents us with a difficult question. Not whether lives should be saved, but what society is willing to tolerate in the pursuit of saving them. Because the incubator worked, that fact complicates every moral judgment surrounding it. Had the exhibitions been ineffective, history would likely remember them as grotesque curiosities, another example of Victorian spectacle overwhelming human dignity. But survival alters the equation. Children lived who otherwise might not have, and so the ethical boundaries surrounding the process become negotiable. The incubator reveals a society deeply committed to progress, but equally committed to spectacle. Victorian culture placed enormous faith in public demonstration. Industry, science, and empire all displayed themselves openly, inviting audiences to witness advancement directly. The incubator followed the same logic. Progress had to be seen to be believed. Perhaps that's what makes it feel so unsettling now. Not the machine itself, but the transparency of the transaction surrounding it. Hope was funded publicly. Vulnerability became observable. Compassion and commerce operated side by side with remarkably little effort to separate them. Yet it would be too easy to regard this as uniquely Victorian. Modern societies remain deeply comfortable, turning human vulnerability into spectacle, provided the framing appears to be sufficiently benevolent. We continue to monetize suffering, package resilience, and publicize survival stories in ways that reassure audiences as much as they assist the subjects. The mechanisms change, the instinct rarely does. The incubator, therefore, survives not merely as a medical device, but as a reflection of broader human tendency. The belief that if the outcome is good enough, the discomfort surrounding the method can be accommodated afterwards. Progress, once proven effective, acquires its own moral gravity. And perhaps the most unsettling inventions are not the ones that fail, but the ones that succeed. With that, we close the Cabinet of Curiosities until next time. Thank you, as ever, for joining me in this gallery of invention and unease. If tonight's exhibit has held your attention, do consider subscribing, or perhaps recommending the programme to a fellow traveller of history's darker corridors. These inventions often reveal far more than their makers intended. Until we open the cabinet again, I remain your faithful guide. Farewell.